The Wars of Independence, 1918 to 1921. Once Poland had achieved re-independence on the 11th of November 1918, many might have thought this was the end of Polish travails. It was not, as it proved to be only the beginning. The First World War had also finished on the same day, but fighting continued in the lands of the former East Central European empires, as the newly established states such as Poland and Czechoslovakia began to make land grabs from one another. Poland had many hostile states, new and old, on her frontiers. To the west there was Germany, which had torn itself apart during November 1918, owing to military defeat, the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and domestic revolution. While the new state of Czechoslovakia was also hostile towards Poland, as it tried to establish frontiers. However, the main threat was to come from the east. Russia was convulsed by revolution, as the Bolsheviks, an extreme left-wing group, had seized power in the autumn of 1917 and had ousted the fledgling democratic government of Kerensky. This had led to civil war in Russia. The first major war that the Polish army fought was against the Ukrainians, as they also tried to carve out a state for themselves. The Polish army was started from scratch in November 1918 and had come from many quarters. This was, as can be imagined, those veterans from Piłsudski's legions, as well as men who had served in the three ex-imperial armies, with the largest cohort coming from the ex-imperial Austrian army. The bone of contention of the Ukrainian-Polish War, fought between 1918 and 1919, was the city of Lvov, or as it is known today, Lviv. Lvov was a Polish cultural centre set in a sea of Ukrainian nationalism. As we've seen from the first lecture, Poland had ruled parts of Ukraine for several hundred years, and even with western Ukraine being part of the Austrian Empire, Polish landlords and overseers remained in control of millions of Ukrainians, who were in many ways subservient to the Polish masters and bitterly resented the situation. Thus, once the Russian Empire imploded, Ukrainians dared to dream of an independent homeland, but the advance of the Polish army began to threaten that aspiration. Equally, many Poles wanted the best for Poland, with some even dreaming of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had seen the combined territories reaching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. A concept from sea to sea was reborn. The fighting of the Ukrainian-Polish War of 1918-1919 was largely localised in the Lvov area. The city was initially captured by the Ukrainians, but was soon liberated by the Polish army. However, Lvov was then besieged by Ukrainian forces. There was further fighting in and around the routes leading in and out of Lvov, as well as fighting over local oil fields. As can be already anticipated, there were to be other fronts in the Polish wars for independence. Or to be more realistic, wars for frontiers, as a Wild West attitude began to ferment across East Central Europe. Poland, despite not having too much support from the Western nations in its fight to establish its frontiers, was however to supply Europe an important service, as it was to prevent the spread of communism into Europe for a generation. The Russian Revolution and the resulting civil war caused concern, if not alarm, across Europe, especially, naturally enough, amongst the ruling classes. The Russian Revolution had seen the Russian imperial family murdered, while other aristocrats also suffered the same fate or were forced into exile abroad. But in Europe itself there was the fear that the ideals of communism or Bolshevism would also take root. There was turmoil enough in East Central Europe, especially in Germany, as the extreme left and right fought one another in the streets in what was very close to civil war. At one point, Bavaria became a socialist republic, with Soviet or workers' councils being established. Into this fevered atmosphere, Adolf Hitler cut his teeth and took full advantage of the situation in Germany, and finally in 1933 was able to seize control of Germany and impose Nazi rule there, and eventually led his country to destruction in 1945. However, in 1919 and 1920, Hitler was hardly known, but Poland and Russia, or Soviet Russia, were about to clash on the battlefield. In Western Poland, paramilitaries, both German and Polish, clashed over territories, especially Silesia in the south, but it was the East that was about to make the difference to Europe. The chaos of the Russian Civil War had allowed the Poles to encroach on Russian territory. Of course, as briefly discussed earlier, it was becoming a matter of what was actually Russian territory or not. Ukraine had been annexed into the Russian Empire, but was also the starting point historically of the Russian people. But in 1920, Ukrainians were determined that the so-called Russian lands were to become Ukraine. For pragmatic reasons, looking at the successes of the Polish army from 1918 to date, the Ukrainian leader, Simon Petlura, allegedly invited Piłsudski to send an army into Ukraine to prevent a re-annexation of the country by the Red Army, and to establish some form of stability from which an independent Ukraine might be established. This was a risky venture for the Ukrainian leadership because, as we have seen, the Poles had been overlords in Ukraine and had kept Ukrainians in subjugation. Whatever the reason for the Polish entry into Ukraine, the Polish army was by 1920 at the very gates of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. The Bolsheviks and Russians were determined about two things: the recapture of land, which had largely made up the former Russian Empire. The Soviets were just as imperialist as the British in the past and the Americans and Chinese today, and to guarantee the spread of the world revolution, a basic Marxist tenet calling for the overthrow of capitalism where and whenever possible. The weakness of the Western democracies may have caused the Bolsheviks to consider that the time was ripe for world revolution across Europe. The arrival of the Polish army at Kiev and its subsequent occupation of the city, albeit very briefly, caused the Bolsheviks to counterattack and began to push the Polish army back across Ukraine and deep into Poland. It would seem that the heathens had arrived at the very outpost of civilization and that the barbarians were at the door. By 1920, 1 full year after the end of the First World War, and the fighting between the major European powers had ceased, at least, Europe was still in turmoil. As already mentioned, 1917, there was a revolution in Russia, which had altered the social system there, or as it turned out, to replace one tyranny with another. But in 1920, it seemed to many oppressed people in Europe that the Bolshevik Revolution had something, a chance to overthrow the establishment and start up political systems which actually represented the workers and peasants. It was a chance that never had been seen by many. Revolt was all the vogue at the time, as nationalists also wished to establish themselves, and it is no coincidence that the original aim of the Nazi Party was National Socialism, while many Nazis, fascists and communists managed to flip-flop between the ideologies, making and doing as the situation demanded. However, Poland was different, as the problem for the Russians or Soviets was that they were Russians. There was no hint of pan-Slavianism or brother workers. Poles hated the Russians for being Russian. Furthermore, Bolshevik ideology was firmly anti-religion, if not murderous toward those who practiced it, and certainly toward those who led the faith, such as priests, monks and nuns. Superficially, Poland is a Christian country, with Catholicism being the dominant faith. However, any attack on the Catholic Church would have been perceived as an attack on Poland. A godless horde coming from the east was an easy image for the Polish authorities to rally their people against, and there were some lurid images of a demonized Trotsky, the Soviet war leader, amongst others who were produced at the time. But lurid images of the devil was not enough to fend off the advancing Red Army, and soon the Soviets were at the gates of Warsaw. The Western powers had no interest in allowing Poland to fall and to let the Bolsheviks advance into Germany, from where Marx had always considered that any true proletariat revolt should begin and succeed. It was clear that if the Red Army did get to Berlin, Germany would fall, and perhaps France afterwards. A world revolution indeed. And so the British and French governments had sent military missions earlier to see what might be done. One such Frenchman was a certain Charles de Gaulle, who was desperate to jumpstart his military career after being in German captivity between 1916 and 1918. Having missed much of the First World War, de Gaulle wanted to make up what he perceived as losses in his career, and so volunteered to participate in the Polish-Soviet War, serving alongside the Polish army. He was later to learn that a fellow ex-prisoner, Marshal Tyrchowski, actually commanded one of the Red Armies moving westward. The Polish army defending Poland against the Red Army in 1920 had been found wanting. Despite the legends built around the Polish-Soviet War, mainly by Poles, the reality was that many Polish officers were quite incompetent and at times cowardly, as there were records of them abandoning their men in the face of the Bolshevik advance. Indeed, after the war had finished, the British military mission reported that there were only 2 competent Polish officers in the entire Polish army during 1920. One of them was General Władysław Sikorski, who was to play a large part in Polish history between 1939 and 1943. There were no easy victories against the Red Army, as for the first time the nascent Polish army was fighting a more disciplined and better led force than had been the experience of Polish troops and officers from 1918. The Polish army had to call on its experienced officers, especially those who had wartime experience. These came mainly from the ex-Imperial Austrian army, but it was French military officers which were to make the difference at Warsaw in 1920. As the Red Army advanced towards Warsaw, it seemed to the Western powers that Poland was doomed, and the best thing that might be done was to try to salvage something in the form of a peace treaty, and so the Polish government was encouraged by the Western powers, mainly France and the UK, to sue for peace. For the Polish army in 1920, there were many problems, but the main one was that it was dysfunctional. The Polish General Staff and its work was lamentable. It kept no regular hours for anything. Written orders were rarely given, but instead vague instructions by telephone were made instead. The Polish General Staff were also dishonest in its relationship with the French. The loss of the town of Bryansk was concealed from General Weygard for nearly 48 hours. Overall, the Polish army was very sloppy, with little idea how to coordinate an extended front, or even how to occupy a village, as there was no concept of outposts. Instead, a Polish unit would merely move into a position and doss down and sleep with no idea what might be just ahead of them. Furthermore, the constant retreats and withdrawals affected the morale of the Polish troops, while there was no attempt to stop deserters or stragglers. The Polish government was described as being a government of all vices, and was also making no serious attempt to rally the nation for the defence of their country, and seemed blind to both the gravity of the situation and to the capacity of the High Command to deal with it. It was clear to the French and the British that they would have to intervene, or Poland would be lost to the Bolsheviks and Germany wide open for world revolution. This was just what the West had feared, and as long as the Bolsheviks remained in what was loosely termed as Asia, it was fine. But they crossed a line, literally, when the Red Army crossed into eastern Poland and invaded Europe. Part of the problem for the West was that the Polish frontiers had not been really fixed in the east, while those in the West were not too certain. However, events in the east were very much like the Wild West, as the various new states continued to make their land grabs and did not give a hang about what the Western powers might have fought. In many ways, the West was not in a position to defend themselves against a full Bolshevik invasion through Germany, and so the defence of Poland had become one of prime importance. The problems in Europe were multiple, as there were several massive movements of people, not only as a result of the end of the First World War, which saw many people returning to the countries, such as British and American service personnel, but also Belgian refugees returning home, while those from the former East Central European empires also returned to their respective homelands. Often they were former soldiers who became involved in trying to help establish new frontiers. At the same time, the Russian Revolution raged, complete with civil war and the ambition to completely take over Europe, if not the world. This was also complicated by a pandemic, as the so-called and certainly erroneously named Spanish flu had just ravaged the world, killing millions. Poland also had a typhoid epidemic. Therefore, two countries wrecked by war, even if they had been victors and further blighted by the consequences of war, seemingly could do little about the Bolshevik advance, and certainly were not going to contribute troops in order to shore up the Polish army. It was already clear from the UK that there was little support for Poland at many levels in society. Therefore, the British and French military missions had to step up to the plate if Europe, and ultimately the world, was to be saved from the spread of communism. The first thing that the French had to do was to coordinate a defence plan for the Poles. The British had placed themselves at the disposal of the French commander, General Weygand. The first steps taken was to resupply Poland, and British troops unloaded arms destined for Poland at the free city of Danzig, today the Polish port of Gdansk. The French observed a dichotomy between the Polish ministers and the Polish General Staff. The Polish politicians seemed to have more faith in Weygand than their own Chief of Staff, General Rozwadowski, who offered to resign in favour of Weygand. Weygand refused the position, but made it quite clear that he would not be held responsible for any further failings of the Polish army. The problem for the French was that the Polish army was not really an army, but instead a hodgepodge of amateurish militias with ex-officers from the former imperial armies hoping to guide them to victory. Piłsudski, even though he claimed to have been an avid student of Napoleon, had no idea of how a war should be conducted. The French considered neither the Poles nor the Soviets had any real idea of how to use their weapons, while strategy was a mystery to most of them. When the Poles finally and unexpectedly defeated the Soviets at Warsaw, the French concluded that the main reason for the Polish victory was the inefficiency of the Soviets, who used untrained peasants who were marched towards Polish cannon with the use of terror of military commissars in the rear, thus cutting off any chance of retreating or, quite bluntly, running away from danger. Only 2 Polish officers cut the mustard as far as the French were concerned: General Sikorski, the commander of 5th Army, and Colonel Zagorski, Chief of Staff to General Hallers. After Warsaw, it was decided that the French army needed an officer corps, and Poland was to look to France for this. What was identified by the British and the French during the summer of 1920 was a flaw that was to haunt Poland during the interwar period and into the Second World War, and now has recently been revived in the last few years, and that is the question of the Piłsudski legend. As we have previously seen, Piłsudski was not a soldier, far from it. His followers were not soldiers, but over-enthusiastic amateurs who thought that they were soldiers. This was the basic of the legions, especially what became later the 1st Brigade. The problem, by the end of September 1920, after the Red Army had been completely cleared from Poland, was that the Polish army, as one might term it, but in reality that element of Piłsudskiites who continued to follow the Marshal, as many referred to him, felt that they were owed, as in their minds they had created Poland and had carved the new frontiers which made for a larger Poland than the Western powers were comfortable with. The Treaty of Riga established the Polish frontiers, which gave Poland parts of western Ukraine, including the Polish cultural centre of Lwów, as well as towns which were more or less Polish colonies surrounded by a massive Ukrainian territory but ruled from Warsaw. To the west and north, unfriendly frontiers were established with Germany, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia. The new headache was the frontiers with Germany, as the new Polish Republic bisected Germany and left East Prussia cut off and isolated from the rest of Germany. This was storing trouble for the future, but in 1921, Germany was weakened by military defeat in revolution which occurred in 1918, accompanied by general civil unrest as the extreme left and right fought one another for supremacy. Russia had just been humbled by Poland. The age-old problem for Poland was its hostile neighbours, Germany and Russia. In 1921, neither of these were in a position to menace the newly born Poland, but it would only become a matter of time before one of the 2 countries would be in a position to endanger Poland. Poland had often learnt to deal with a single hostile power on its borders. The problem arose when both of its neighbours allied to the detriment of Poland. This is what Poland had always feared.